The helicopter ride to the offshore rig had been a blur of rotor noise and stomach-dropping dips through patches of turbulence. My new hard hat felt too tight around my temples as I stepped onto the metal landing pad, ducking low despite the rotors being well above my head. Gulf waters stretched in every direction, a vast blue nothing surrounding our isolated metal island. "Adams, over here!" A man in a yellow safety vest waved me toward a set of stairs. "Welcome to Deepwater Horizon 2. The name felt like tempting fate, considering what had happened to the original, but oil companies weren't known for their superstition or sensitivity. I followed him down to what he called the orientation deck, a glorified conference room with salt-streaked windows and the lingering smell of industrial cleaner. My first morning passed in a stream of safety videos, paperwork, and instructions that blurred together. The maintenance job I'd taken was straightforward enough. Troubleshooting electrical systems, replacing worn components, basic mechanical upkeep. But the sheer volume of emergency protocols made my head spin. The pay was worth it, though. 3 weeks on, 1 week off, at twice what I'd made on land. At lunch, I sat alone in the cafeteria, pushing mystery meat around my tray while trying to memorize the complex layout of the rig from the pocket map they'd given us. The room buzzed with conversation, the easy camaraderie of men who'd worked together through countless shifts. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see an older man standing over my table, tray in hand. His face was lined with deep creases, skin darkened from years under the sun. Even indoors, his eyes squinted slightly, as if permanently adjusted to harsh glare. "Go ahead," I said, moving my backpack off the chair beside me. "Jeff Martinez," he said, setting down his tray. "Heard you're the new maintenance guy. Tyler, right?" "Yeah, Tyler Adams." I offered my hand, noting the calluses on his palm as we shook. "First day." Jeff nodded, studying me with an intensity that felt out of place for casual lunch conversation. "How much they tell you about working here?" "Enough to make me wonder if I'll die by fire, explosion, or drowning," I joked. He didn't smile. "Those aren't what you need to worry about." I took a bite of my sandwich, waiting for him to elaborate. When he didn't, I asked, "So what should I worry about?" Jeff glanced around the cafeteria, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn thin at the creases. He smoothed it flat on the table and slid it toward me. The paper contained a handwritten list. 1. Always stay with at least one other person. 2. Never leave the rig for any reason. 3. No whistling, ever. 4. Stay away from the north side after dark. 5. Ignore any purple flares. 6. Don't speak to anyone you don't recognize. I read the list twice, waiting for the punchline. When I looked up, Jeff was watching me, his expression deadly serious. "What is this?" I asked. "Some kind of initiation thing?" "Those are the rules," he said, his voice low. "Not company rules, our rules. You follow them, you stay alive." "Right." I tried to hand the paper back, but he pushed it toward me. "Keep it. Memorize it. This isn't a joke, kid." Something in his tone made me uncomfortable. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. "So what happens if someone whistles? The rig explodes?" Jeff's jaw tightened. "I've been here 15 years, seen a lot of guys come and go. The ones who take this seriously tend to leave on the helicopter. The ones who don't." He trailed off, picking up his fork. "Well, let's just say there are other ways to leave." "Like what?" "Like not at all." Jeff stabbed at his food. "Listen, I know how this sounds. I'd have laughed too, my first day. But these rules aren't suggestions. They're requirements." I took another bite of my sandwich, buying time to think. This had to be some kind of weird hazing ritual for newcomers. Make the new guy paranoid, have a laugh about it later. But Jeff didn't look like he was enjoying himself. "So, what's on the north side at night?" I asked, deciding to play along. Jeff's eyes darted toward the windows. "Nothing you want to meet. Just stay away from it." "Have you ever been there, at night?" He set down his fork, hands flat on the table. "Once, heard knocking, like someone was underwater, hitting the support pillars. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Could have been debris caught in the current," I suggested. "Debris doesn't knock in patterns." Jeff leaned forward. "And debris doesn't stop when you call out to it." A chill ran down my back despite my skepticism. "What do you mean?" I asked who was there. The knocking stopped. Then it started again, closer. That's when I ran. He picked up his fork again. Never went back. I wanted to press for more details, but something in his expression made me stop. Either he genuinely believed what he was saying, or he was an incredible actor. "Jeff," a voice called from across the room. "Brandon wants you in control." Jeff stood, gathering his tray. "Think about what I said. Talk to some of the other guys if you don't believe me." I watched him go, the paper feeling strangely heavy in my pocket. After lunch, I reported to the maintenance office where I met my supervisor, Brandon Johnson. He was younger than Jeff, but carried himself with the assured confidence of someone comfortable with authority. "Adams, right? Got your assignment here." He handed me a tablet with a work order. "Just basic checks today. Get you familiar with the systems. Diego will show you around." As Diego led me through a maze of corridors, I debated whether to mention Jeff's warning. Curiosity won out. "So I met Jeff Martinez at lunch," I said casually. "He gave me some unofficial rules." Diego glanced back at me, his expression unreadable. "Jeff's been here longer than almost anyone. You believe that stuff? The whistling in the north side?" Diego stopped walking. "Look, man, Jeff's kept a lot of people alive. That's all I'm saying." He continued down the corridor before I could ask more. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of inspection points and system checks. As we worked our way through the maintenance route, I began to notice something odd. No one was ever alone. Technicians moved in pairs, engineers consulted in groups of 3, even the guys washing down the deck worked side by side despite having enough mops for one person per section. At first, I thought it might be a standard safety protocol. Buddy systems were common enough in dangerous environments, but there was something almost instinctive about it, the way crews naturally clustered without discussion. When one man stepped away to grab a tool, his partner would follow without a word. "Is there a rule about working in pairs?" I asked Diego as we finished checking a control panel. "Company recommends it," he said vaguely. "Safer that way." "Seems inefficient." Diego shrugged. "Efficiency isn't everything out here." As the day wore on, I found myself watching the crew more carefully. There was a rhythm to their movement, an awareness of each other's positions that seemed practiced. When shifts changed, people waited for others before moving to new areas. No one seemed to mind the extra time it took. By evening, my initial dismissal of Jeff's warning had softened into curiosity. The rules still seemed absurd. No whistling, ignore purple flares. But the crew's behavior suggested there might be more to the story than a simple hazing ritual. As we finished the final checks, Diego pointed to a distant section of the rig visible through a porthole. "That's the north side. Processing units are over there, but we do minimal maintenance after dark. Schedule's built around daylight hours for that section." "Because of the rule?" I asked, testing his reaction. Diego's face remained neutral. "Because of company policy." When we returned to the maintenance office, Brandon was reviewing reports at his desk. "All good?" he asked, looking up from his screen. "Finished the circuit," Diego confirmed. "Tyler's picking it up quick." Brandon nodded. "Good. Last transport boat's heading in. We're on our own until resupply on Thursday." As Diego left, Brandon gestured for me to sit. "First day go okay?" "Yeah, fine," I said. "Just getting oriented." "Heard Jeff talk to you?" Brandon's tone was casual, but his eyes were watchful. I hesitated. "He gave me some unusual safety advice." "Jeff's careful," Brandon said. "Some people think he's paranoid. But he's been here longer than most, and there's a reason for that." He tapped his fingers on the desk. "People listen to him." "So you're saying I should take his list seriously?" Brandon leaned back in his chair. "I'm saying Jeff keeps people alive. Take that however you want." The conversation left me with more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. Jeff wasn't alone in his beliefs. Whatever was behind the rules, multiple people on the rig seemed to follow them. That night, in the small bunk room I shared with 2 other maintenance workers, I pulled out the crumpled paper and read through the rules again. They still seemed ridiculous in the fluorescent lighting of the rig's interior, safely removed from dark waters and mysterious knockings. But as I listened to the constant hum of machinery and the occasional creak of metal adjusting to wind and waves, I couldn't shake the image of Jeff's face as he talked about the north side. He hadn't looked like someone playing a prank. He'd looked like someone who'd seen something he couldn't explain. I tucked the paper back into my pocket and turned off my light. The rules probably were just superstition, born from isolation and the natural dangers of rig work. But as I drifted towards sleep, I found myself making a mental note to pay closer attention tomorrow. After all, I was here for 3 weeks. Plenty of time to figure out if there was any truth to Jeff's warning. And if not, well, at least I'd have a good story to tell when I got back to shore. The cafeteria buzzed with end-of-shift conversation as I joined the dinner line. After spending the day following Diego around the rig, learning systems and protocols, I was ready to collapse into my bunk. Instead, I found myself watching the other workers with new interest, Jeff's list of rules burning a hole in my pocket. I loaded my tray with something resembling beef stew and scanned the room for an empty seat. The tables were arranged in long rows, most already filled with men talking over their meals. I spotted an open spot near Kyle Davis and Stephen Parker, 2 roughnecks I'd met briefly during orientation. As I approached, I caught fragments of their conversation. "Just not worth the risk," Kyle was saying, his voice low but intense. "Brandon can wait until morning for the inventory." Stephen nodded, shoveling food into his mouth between words. "I know that room gives me the creeps anyway. Remember what happened to Ramirez when he—" They both looked up as I set my tray down. "Mind if I join you guys?" I asked. Kyle gestured to the empty seat. "All yours. You're Tyler, right? New maintenance guy?" I sat down, noticing how they shifted slightly to include me in their circle. "That's me. First day down." "How's it going so far?" Stephen asked, his attention already drifting back to his food. "Good. Lots to learn." I took a bite of the stew, which tasted better than it looked. "I'm supposed to check the storage room by the drilling platform tomorrow. Anything I should know about it?" The reaction was immediate. Both men stopped eating, exchanging a quick glance. "You going alone?" Kyle asked, his casual tone sounding forced. I shrugged. "Probably. Diego mentioned it's just a routine check." Kyle set down his fork. "Bad idea. That room's a maze of shelving. If something falls, no one would hear you." "I can handle a few shelves," I said, watching their reactions carefully. Stephen shook his head. "Look, new guy, no one goes anywhere alone on this rig. Company policy." "Funny, I didn't see that in the safety manual." "Unwritten policy," Kyle clarified, his eyes serious. "Trust me, you don't want to be the exception." Before I could push further, a cheerful whistle cut through the cafeteria noise. The melody was upbeat, something that might accompany a cartoon character strolling down a sidewalk. 3 tables away, a young technician was whistling absently while wiping down his tray. The reaction around me was electric. Kyle's head snapped up, his face draining of color. Stephen immediately slammed his palm against the table, the sharp crack drawing attention. Across the room, 2 other workers shouted almost in unison. "Hey, cut that out! No whistling! Jesus Christ, man!" The technician stopped mid-note, looking startled. "Sorry, wasn't thinking," he called back, ducking his head in embarrassment. The tension in the room eased, conversations gradually resuming. I glanced between Kyle and Stephen, who had returned to their meals as if nothing unusual had happened. "That seems like an overreaction to whistling," I commented. Kyle looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Not if you know what happens after." "And what's that?" "Ask Jeff," Stephen muttered. "He's seen it." The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. I finished quickly and stood to leave, stopping when Kyle grabbed my arm. "Look, about tomorrow, wait for Diego. Don't go to that storage room alone." His grip was tight enough to make a point without being threatening. I nodded, and he released me. As I crossed the cafeteria to return my tray, I noticed workers moving in groups toward the exit, clustering together as they headed to their evening posts. No one walked alone. Not a single person. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. I spent the next hour in the recreation room, ostensibly flipping through an old magazine, but actually observing the off-duty crew. They played cards, watched television, made calls home on the satellite phones. Normal activities for men with limited entertainment options. But there were patterns in their behavior that stood out now that I was looking for them. No one left the room individually. When one man got up for a snack, his card partner waited, pausing the game until both returned. 2 engineers heading to the bathroom went together, one waiting outside the stall for the other. A technician asking for help moving equipment immediately had 3 volunteers, despite the job requiring only 1 extra pair of hands. Getting settled in, Brandon appeared beside my chair, a cup of coffee in his hand. I set the magazine aside. "Just taking it all in. Interesting group dynamics." "How so?" His tone was casual, but I caught the flicker of alertness in his expression. "Seems like everyone's very cooperative," I said carefully. "Buddy system taken to the extreme." Brandon took a slow sip of his coffee. "Works well for us. Keeps everyone safe." "Safe from what exactly?" He studied me for a moment. "You know, there's a maintenance check needed on the Southwest Junction box. Mind handling it?" The abrupt change of subject caught me off guard. "Sure, where's that?" "Other side of the drill deck. Pretty isolated spot." He checked his watch. "Should take about 20 minutes if you head over now." I stood, recognizing the test for what it was. Should I grab Diego or someone to help? Brandon's expression gave nothing away. "It's a one-person job, but if you want company, I can handle it," I said, matching his neutral tone. Brandon nodded and handed me his tablet with the work order. "Third level down, past the backup generators." I headed toward the equipment locker first, gathering the tools listed on the work order. As I prepared to leave, the door opened and my assigned partner for the day, Diego, stepped in. Brandon radioed, "Said you're checking the Southwest Junction?" He grabbed a tool belt without waiting for my response. "It's a simple check," I said. "I can handle it." Diego shrugged, already heading toward the door. "Coming with you anyway. Got nothing better to do." "You were just about to start your break," I pointed out, having overheard him mentioning it earlier. "Break can wait." I followed him through the maze of corridors, down 2 flights of stairs, and across the drill deck. The junction box was exactly where Brandon had described, tucked away in a corner that required navigating around several large pieces of equipment. As I worked through the maintenance checklist, Diego leaned against the railing, occasionally glancing toward the darkened areas of the deck. "You didn't have to come," I said, testing him. "I know you've been on shift longer than me." "Not how things work here," he replied simply. "Because of the rules?" I pressed. Diego didn't answer immediately. When he did speak, his voice was quieter than before. "You've been asking a lot of questions today. Just trying to understand how things operate. Some things you don't need to understand. You just need to follow them." I closed the junction box, having completed the checks. "That's not really how my brain works." Diego pushed off from the railing. "Then you're going to have a hard time here." We walked back in silence. As we approached the main corridor, Jeff was coming the opposite direction. His eyes moved from me to Diego, then settled on my face with an evaluating look. "Brandon said he sent you to the Southwest Junction," Jeff said. "Just finished," I replied. "Diego came along." Jeff nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "Got a minute?" Diego took the cue and continued on, leaving me alone with Jeff in the corridor. "Brandon was testing you," Jeff said once Diego was out of earshot. I figured as much. Jeff's weathered face showed no surprise at my admission. "Come with me." He led me to a small maintenance office, empty at this hour, and closed the door behind us. The room was cramped, dominated by a desk covered in technical manuals and parts catalogs. "You think the rules are bullshit," Jeff stated flatly. It wasn't a question. I considered lying, then decided against it. "I think there's probably a reasonable explanation for most of them." "Like what?" "The buddy system makes sense from a safety standpoint. Rigs are dangerous places, and maybe the north side has structural issues or equipment that's particularly hazardous at night." Jeff leaned against the desk, arms crossed over his chest. "And the whistling? The purple flares? People you don't recognize?" I had no ready explanation for those. "Look, I'm not saying there isn't something to be careful about. I'm just trying to understand what we're actually dealing with." "We're dealing with things that kill people," Jeff said, his voice hardening. "These rules aren't suggestions. They're not superstitions. They're written in blood by workers who learned too late." His intensity was uncomfortable. I shifted my weight, maintaining eye contact despite wanting to look away. "Brandon mentioned you've been here 15 years. That's a long time on one rig." 14 years, 8 months, he corrected. "And I'm still here because I follow the rules." "What about the ones who don't?" Jeff's hands moved to the edge of the desk, gripping it tightly. I noticed then how they trembled slightly, an involuntary motion at odds with his controlled expression. "Last year," he said, his voice lower now, "2 guys from the drilling crew decided the north side restriction was bullshit. Decker and Williams. Been here about 4 months, long enough to hear the rules, but not long enough to believe them." I waited as Jeff gathered himself, the tremor in his hands becoming more pronounced. They went to the north side after sunset. Some kind of bet. Williams was filming on his phone. Jeff's knuckles whitened against the desk. We heard the screaming 10 minutes later. By the time we got there, the railing was bent outward, like something had hit it from the inside. No sign of either of them. They could have fallen, I suggested, though the image of the bent railing was difficult to rationalize. Search team found nothing. No bodies, no debris. Just Williams' phone, still recording. Jeff's eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder. The video showed them joking around, then something moving in the water. They leaned over to see it better. Then the phone drops, they're screaming, and the recording goes black. What was in the water? I asked, despite myself. Jeff shook his head. Company confiscated the phone. Official report said they fell during horseplay and drowned. But I saw the railing, Tyler. Something pulled them over. Something strong enough to bend industrial steel. The small office felt suddenly claustrophobic. I wanted to dismiss Jeff's story as exaggeration or misinterpretation, but the tremor in his hands wasn't an act. Whatever he believed he'd seen had genuinely terrified him. Do all the rules have stories like that behind them? I asked. Every single one. Jeff pushed himself away from the desk. The whistling attracts them. The purple flares are a lure. The north side is where they come aboard. The strangers, he hesitated. The strangers are something else entirely. They, I repeated. What exactly are we talking about here, Jeff? I don't name them, he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Names give things power, but they're in the water. They're watching the rig, and they want us. The conversation had ventured fully into the realm of the irrational now. I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to antagonize him, but finding it increasingly difficult to pretend I accepted these claims. Look, I said carefully, I appreciate you looking out for the crew, for me. I'll be careful, I promise. Jeff studied my face, clearly reading the skepticism I was trying to hide. You don't believe me yet. That's okay. Nobody does at first. He moved toward the door. But remember the rules anyway. They'll keep you alive long enough to see the truth for yourself. After Jeff left, I remained in the office for several minutes, processing the conversation. His fear had been genuine. I had no doubt about that, but fear could distort perception, create patterns from coincidence. Isolation and danger were powerful catalysts for superstition, yet the entire crew seemed to share these beliefs to some degree. Brandon, supposedly the rational authority figure, had engineered a test specifically to see if I'd follow the buddy system rule that went beyond individual delusion into collective behavior. I needed more information, but not filtered through Jeff's lens of absolute certainty. I needed to see for myself what happened on the north side after dark. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. I joined a card game in the recreation room, listening more than participating as the conversation flowed around me. No one mentioned the rules directly, but I caught references, subtle warnings when someone prepared to leave alone, casual redirections when topics veered toward the north side. By lights out at 11, I had formulated a plan. The bunk room I shared with 2 other maintenance workers fell quiet quickly, both men exhausted from their shifts. I lay awake, watching the minutes tick by on the digital clock, waiting for midnight when the rig would be at its quietest. The rules might have rational explanations, or they might be collective delusions born from isolation and stress. Either way, I needed to know. Tonight, I would go to the north side and see for myself what happened after dark. And if Jeff was right, well, I'd have my answer then too. Around midnight, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my roommates. Their steady breathing filled our cramped quarters as I pulled on my boots without lacing them. Quieter that way. I grabbed my flashlight but left it off. The emergency lights in the hallway would be enough until I reached the north side. The metal floor felt cold through my socks as I eased the door shut behind me. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, bathed in the dim glow of blue safety lights that cast everything in an underwater hue. I'd memorized the route earlier. 3 corridors, 2 sets of stairs, and across the main platform to reach the north side. Every step echoed more than I wanted. I froze whenever the rig groaned or shifted, natural sounds that suddenly seemed amplified in my heightened state. But no doors opened. No one emerged to question why I was wandering around during the midnight shift change. I reached the first stairwell and descended slowly, keeping to the edges of the steps where they made less noise. The machinery hum grew louder as I went deeper, a constant industrial drone that would help mask my movements. At the bottom, I paused to get my bearings. A sign on the wall showed my position: central platform, east quadrant. The north side lay ahead through 2 more sections. I checked my watch, 12:08 a.m. Perfect timing to prove Jeff wrong and get back to bed before anyone noticed I was gone. The second corridor was darker than the first, with several burnt-out lights creating pools of shadow. I picked up my pace, not from fear, but from practical concern about security cameras. The faster I moved through open areas, the less likely someone monitoring feeds would notice. When I reached the final staircase leading to the north platform, I hesitated. Jeff's warning echoed in my head: never go to the north side after dark. His weathered face had shown genuine fear when he spoke about the knocking sounds. But fear wasn't evidence. People feared plenty of things that had perfectly rational explanations. I started down the stairs, my hand sliding along the metal railing. At the bottom, a heavy door marked North Platform Access stood partially open. A wedge kept it from closing completely, probably left by maintenance staff. Convenient for my investigation. I slipped through the gap and found myself on the north platform. It was darker than I'd expected. While the rest of the rig blazed with lights even at night, this section ran on reduced power. Only emergency lighting illuminated the walkways, casting long shadows across the metal grating. The darkness seemed almost deliberate, as if this part of the rig had been designed to remain hidden after sunset. The platform extended about 50 feet outward, ending at a railing that separated workers from a 100-foot drop to the Gulf waters below. Various pipes and equipment clustered along the sides, but the central walking path remained clear. The emptiness felt wrong somehow, too clean compared to the cluttered workspaces throughout the rest of the rig. I stepped forward cautiously, testing each section of grating before putting my full weight down. Not from fear, just good practice on an unfamiliar part of the rig. The metal walkway extended toward the edge like a finger pointing into the darkness beyond. For several minutes, nothing happened. Just the usual soundtrack of an offshore rig at night. The distant hum of generators, the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting, the soft lapping of waves far below. A breeze carried the smell of salt and diesel across the platform. I walked to the railing and looked out over the water. The moon reflected off the dark surface, creating a silver pathway that stretched to the horizon. No mysterious creatures, no supernatural phenomena, just water and sky and metal. I checked my watch again. 12:14 a.m. This is ridiculous, I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice surprisingly comforting in the emptiness. I leaned against the railing, suddenly feeling foolish. What had I expected? Glowing sea monsters? Ghosts of drowned sailors? Jeff was just another old-timer using scary stories to maintain status among newcomers. The rules probably started as practical safety measures that evolved into superstitions over time. I decided to give it 5 more minutes before heading back. Better to be thorough if I was going to disprove these myths. That's when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from directly beneath the platform, 3 distinct raps against the metal hull, clear and deliberate, like someone using their knuckles on a door. I froze, my hands tightening on the railing. Silence followed, stretching for maybe 15 seconds. Knock. 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 Again, the same pattern. 3 evenly spaced knocks, exactly as Jeff had described. The sound resonated through the metal structure, traveling up through the supports to where I stood. My mind raced for explanations. Debris caught in the currents, equipment malfunction, pipes expanding in the night air. Metal structures made all kinds of sounds, especially ones exposed to ocean and weather. Knock, knock, knock. The third set hit harder, loud enough that I felt the vibration through my boots. The knocking came from directly below me, impossible given the rig's height above water. Even at high tide, the Gulf surface remained at least 70 feet down. Nothing floating could reach the underside of this platform. I backed away from the railing, maintaining my rational approach. Sound traveled strangely over water, especially at night. What seemed to come from below might actually originate from elsewhere on the rig. Some mechanical process I hadn't learned about yet. Knock, knock, knock. Louder now, unmistakably closer. No longer coming from beneath, but from the edge of the platform, as if whatever made the sound was climbing up the support structure. The pattern was too perfect to be random, the increasing volume too purposeful to be environmental. My skepticism began crumbling as another set of knocks rang out, now from just beyond the railing. Knock, knock, knock. My heart rate spiked. I took another step back, eyes fixed on the edge where the platform extended over the water. I still saw nothing unusual, but the knocking continued, moving horizontally now as if tracking my movement along the railing. I remembered Jeff's words. Debris doesn't knock in patterns, and debris doesn't stop when you call out to it. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded thin and uncertain. The knocking stopped immediately. Complete silence fell across the platform, more terrifying than the noise had been. Then it started again. Knock, knock, knock. Much louder now. Multiple points along the railing knocked simultaneously, a coordinated response to my voice. Whatever rational explanation I'd been clinging to evaporated. Panic surged through me, overwhelming my skepticism. I turned and ran, no longer caring about noise or cameras or looking foolish. My boots pounded against the metal grating as I sprinted back toward the access door, the knocking accelerating behind me, faster and louder with each set of 3. I slammed through the door, not bothering to close it behind me, and took the stairs 2 at a time. My breathing came in ragged gasps, driven by a primal fear I couldn't process. All I knew was that I needed to get away from the north side as quickly as possible. The knocking followed me to the stairwell, then abruptly stopped as I reached the main level. The sudden silence felt almost as threatening as the sound had been. I didn't slow down, racing through the corridors back toward the living quarters. As I rounded the final corner, I nearly collided with someone standing in the hallway. Jeff stood there, fully dressed despite the late hour. He wore his work boots and jacket as if he'd been prepared to go outside. His expression showed no surprise at seeing me breathless and terrified in the corridor at midnight. Without a word, he gripped my shoulder and guided me toward my room. I wanted to explain, to ask questions, to make sense of what had happened, but my mouth wouldn't form words. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and cold sweat plastered my shirt to my back. Jeff's face showed a mixture of disappointment and understanding, the look of someone who'd seen this reaction before. He knew exactly where I'd been and what I'd heard. He'd been waiting for me to return, or perhaps ready to come looking if I didn't. We reached my door, and Jeff finally spoke, his voice low to avoid waking others. "It stops when you leave. Remember that. Always leave immediately when it starts." I nodded, still unable to respond coherently. "Get some sleep," he said, giving my shoulder a final squeeze. "We'll talk tomorrow." As I slipped back into my room, I realized a critical detail. The knocking had indeed stopped the moment I left the north side, exactly as Jeff had suggested it would. Whatever I'd heard wasn't following me through the rig. It remained confined to that section, as if bound there by rules of its own. My roommates hadn't stirred. Their rhythmic breathing continued undisturbed, grounding me in normality despite what I'd experienced. I removed my boots with shaking hands and lay back on my bunk, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily. Jeff's rules no longer seemed like superstition. The knocking had been real, deliberate, intelligent, and impossible. I'd heard it with my own ears, felt it through the metal beneath my feet. No debris, no malfunction. Something had been trying to get my attention, responding when I called out, moving to track my position. As I stared at the ceiling, one certainty solidified in my mind. I would never go to the north side after dark again. The next evening arrived with a vengeance. Dark clouds had been gathering on the horizon throughout the afternoon, and by dinner time, the rig swayed beneath us as waves grew higher and winds picked up speed. I hadn't slept well after my encounter on the north side, spending most of the day in a fog of exhaustion and lingering unease. Now, as rain lashed against the metal structure and thunder rolled across the sky, I found myself helping Jeff secure loose equipment on the main deck. "Hand me that wrench," Jeff called over the howling wind, his voice barely audible despite standing only a few feet away. I passed him the tool, bracing myself against a support beam as another wave of wind hit us. The rain came sideways, stinging my face and soaking through my supposedly waterproof jacket. My boots slid on the wet metal as I grabbed a tarp that had come loose, fighting to tie it down. "Weather report says we're looking at 60 miles per hour gusts," I shouted, squinting through the downpour. "Waves are already hitting the lower platforms." Jeff nodded grimly, his face partially hidden under his hard hat. "Let's get the rest of this tied down and get inside. Not safe out here much longer." Since my midnight adventure to the north side, Jeff had treated me differently, a subtle shift from wariness to cautious acceptance. He hadn't mentioned finding me in the corridor, but the knowledge sat between us like a shared secret. I had seen enough to stop questioning his rules, and he knew it. We worked methodically, securing everything that could become a projectile in these conditions. The rig creaked and groaned around us, the entire structure moving more than seemed safe for something built of steel and concrete. I'd been told platforms like this could withstand hurricane conditions, but experiencing the violent motion firsthand made that hard to believe. I was coiling a heavy chain when I saw it. Against the dark storm clouds, a bright purple light pulsed in the distance. At first, I thought it might be lightning, but the color was wrong and the pattern too regular. 3 quick flashes, a pause, then 3 more. The universal distress signal. "Jeff," I called, pointing toward the light. "Look." Jeff turned, water streaming from his hard hat. When he saw what I was pointing at, his body went rigid. Even in the poor visibility, I could see his face drain of color. I dropped the chain and moved toward the doorway leading to the communications room. My safety training kicked in automatically. Distress flare meant someone needed help, and protocol demanded we report it immediately. "I'll radio it in," I shouted over my shoulder, already calculating how long it would take to organize a rescue during these conditions. Before I made it 3 steps, Jeff's hand clamped around my arm with surprising strength, yanking me backward. I stumbled, nearly falling on the wet deck. "What the hell, Jeff?" I tried to pull free, but his grip only tightened. He dragged me closer, his face inches from mine. "Rule 5, he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Don't you remember Rule 5? It took me a moment to recall the list he'd given me days earlier. Rule 5, ignore any purple flares. "But that's a distress signal," I argued, watching as the flare pulsed again, its purple light illuminating the churning waves below. "Someone could be dying out there." "There's nothing out there," Jeff said, still gripping my arm. "Nothing human, anyway." My instinct to help warred with the memory of knocking sounds that couldn't exist. I looked back at the flare, studying it more carefully. The color was odd, not the typical red or orange of standard emergency flares, but a deep, unnatural purple that seemed to cut through the storm with impossible clarity. "Come on." Jeff pulled me toward the doorway, away from the sight of the flare. "We need to get inside." As we entered the corridor, I noticed several other workers hurrying through the hallways, their faces set in grim expressions. None of them mentioned the purple light outside, though it was clearly visible through every window and porthole. We made our way to the control room, where Brandon stood surrounded by monitoring equipment, his face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. "We've got a flare about 2 miles southeast," I said as we approached, still not entirely willing to ignore what could be a legitimate emergency. Brandon looked up, his expression unreadable. "Nothing on radar." I saw it. Purple light, distress pattern. Jeff and Brandon exchanged a look that made my stomach tighten. "Check again," I insisted. With a sigh, Brandon typed something into his console. No vessels registered in that direction. No radio chatter. No distress calls. He turned one of the screens toward me, showing a radar image of the surrounding waters. "Nothing's out there, Tyler." I moved to the window, where the purple flare continued its rhythmic pulsing through the storm. "Then what is that?" "Don't look at it," Jeff said sharply. I turned back to the room and noticed something I hadn't before. The other workers in the control room had positioned themselves away from the windows. Some had their backs completely turned. Others kept their eyes fixed firmly on their monitors or the floor. Kyle entered the room, shaking water from his jacket. He glanced toward the window, saw the purple light, and immediately averted his gaze. Without comment, he moved to the far side of the room, his posture tense. "All equipment secured on level 3, he reported to Brandon, his voice deliberately casual. "Good," Brandon replied. "Status check on the drilling platform." "Operation suspended until the storm passes. All systems in safety mode." The conversation continued as if there wasn't a distress signal pulsing outside our window, as if we weren't potentially ignoring someone's cry for help. I moved closer to Brandon, lowering my voice. "What if it's real? What if someone's actually out there, in this weather?" Brandon gestured toward the screens, showing wave height and wind speed. No small craft could survive these conditions, and no large vessel would be this close to our position without proper identification. "Then what is it?" I pressed. Brandon's face hardened. "Focus on your job, Tyler. The storm's the real danger here." For the next 20 minutes, I watched as the purple flare continued its steady pattern. The longer I observed it, the more unnatural it seemed. Despite the driving rain and howling wind, the light never wavered or dimmed. Its position remained fixed, even as the waves beneath it rose and fell with increasing violence. Around me, the crew worked with practiced efficiency, running checks on essential systems and monitoring the rig's stability. No one mentioned the flare. No one looked at it. When necessary tasks took them near windows, they kept their eyes downcast, moving with quick, deliberate steps to get past the view of the outside. Stephen entered the control room at one point, stopping short when he spotted the purple light through the window. His reaction was more extreme than the others. He actually raised his hand to shield his eyes, turning his body away as if the mere sight of the light caused him physical pain. I remembered how I'd found him on the north side, whistling in a trance, and wondered if these phenomena were connected. Eventually, curiosity overcame my caution. I moved back to the window, studying the flare more intently. The purple light seemed to pulse in time with the waves now, as if responding to the rhythm of the storm. There was something hypnotic about its regularity, something almost inviting. I said, "Don't look at it." Jeff appeared beside me, physically turning me away from the window. His face was drawn with tension, eyes focused on mine with fierce intensity. "That's not a mistake you make twice." Before I could respond, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the room. I turned back to the window and saw that the purple light had vanished, leaving only darkness and rain. Almost immediately, I noticed a change in the storm. The howling wind began to subside, its screaming reduced to a low moan. The violent rocking of the platform gentled, becoming more manageable. Even the rain seemed to lighten, no longer driving horizontally against the windows. "It's passing," someone said, the relief in their voice palpable. Brandon checked his instruments, frowning slightly. Barometric pressure rising faster than forecast, wind dropping below 30 knots. He looked up, meeting Jeff's eyes briefly before turning his attention back to the screens. "Looks like we're through the worst of it." The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The flare disappears and suddenly the storm begins to calm. I moved toward Jeff, who was checking a display panel near the door. "What was that?" "Really?" I asked quietly. His hand stilled on the controls, but he didn't look at me. "Don't know what you're talking about." The flare, the storm, the way everyone avoided looking at it, the way it just disappeared and suddenly everything calms down. Jeff finished his check and turned toward me, his expression closed off. "Sometimes it's better not to know everything, Tyler." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. "Night shift starts in 20 minutes. You should get some rest while you can." He walked away, leaving me standing alone with more questions than answers. Around me, the control room had returned to normal operations, the tension visibly draining from the crew as they returned to routine tasks. No one discussed what we'd all just witnessed. No one acknowledged the strange synchronicity between the flare's disappearance and the storm's sudden calming. As I made my way back to my quarters to change into dry clothes, I thought about the rules Jeff had given me that first day. I'd broken one and experienced the knocking firsthand. Now I'd witnessed another rule in action: ignore purple flares, and seen how seriously the entire crew took it. The rational explanations I'd clung to were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Something was happening on this rig that defied conventional understanding. The knocking that responded to my voice. The flare that appeared during the storm, then vanished as the weather cleared. The crew's coordinated, practiced response to phenomena they'd clearly encountered before. I thought about the remaining rules. Always stay with someone else. Don't whistle. Stay away from the north side after dark. Don't speak to people you don't recognize. What horrors waited if those rules were broken? And how much longer could I last on this rig without finding out? 2 days had passed since the storm and the purple flare incident. The memory of that night stayed with me, especially how quickly everyone on the rig had turned away from those eerie purple pulses of light. Even more striking was how the storm had calmed almost immediately after the flare vanished. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone since, but I noticed the crew treated me differently now. Small nods of acknowledgement, less guarded conversations. My skepticism was fading, replaced by a growing unease about what might actually be out there in the Gulf waters surrounding us. I headed toward the drill deck for my afternoon maintenance check, tablet in hand. The The rig had returned to its normal rhythms after the storm. The constant background noise of machinery, voices on radios, and the distant sound of the drill bit cutting through rock hundreds of feet below the ocean floor created the usual industrial soundtrack. As I rounded the corner toward the main hydraulic junction, I spotted a man in standard worker gear, hard hat, coveralls, and tool belt, kneeling beside an exposed hydraulic line. His back was to me as he worked, hands moving steadily over the components. "Hey there," I called out, approaching him. "Need any help?" The man didn't respond or even acknowledge me. He continued working, his movements methodical as he adjusted something on the line. I moved closer, thinking maybe he hadn't heard me over the ambient noise. That's when I noticed something odd. The way he worked was wrong somehow. Each motion was too smooth, too calculated. No wasted movement, no hesitation, no adjusting his grip or position. Just perfect, fluid efficiency that didn't match how people actually worked on mechanical systems. "Excuse me," I tried again, louder this time. He still didn't turn, continuing his work as if I weren't there. I watched him for another moment, trying to place what else bothered me about this scene. His tools gleamed under the overhead lights, not just clean but pristine, without the grime and wear that accumulated on equipment used in the harsh conditions of an offshore rig. A cold feeling spread through my chest as I took in more details. The man worked in complete silence. No grunting with effort, no muttering under his breath, no clanking of tools against metal. The only sound came from the hydraulic line itself, a soft hissing as he manipulated the valves. I took a step back, suddenly remembering Jeff's rules. Rule 6, don't speak to anyone you don't recognize. I'd already broken that rule by calling out to him, but thankfully, he hadn't responded. Then I spotted what should have been obvious from the start. His coveralls had no company logo. Every worker on Deepwater Horizon 2 wore clothing marked with the distinctive blue and green emblem, a safety protocol strictly enforced by management. Even visitors and contractors received temporary branded gear before being allowed on the working areas of the rig. This man wore plain tan coveralls with no identifying marks whatsoever. I backed away slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The stranger continued working, never looking up, still moving with that unnatural precision that made my skin crawl. Once I turned the corner out of sight, I broke into a jog, headed for the machine shop where I knew Jeff would be working this afternoon. My heart beat faster with each step, not from exertion but from a growing certainty that I'd just encountered something impossible. I burst into the machine shop, scanning the room until I spotted Jeff at the far bench, rebuilding a pump assembly with Kyle. "Jeff," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you, now." Jeff must have heard something in my tone because he immediately put down his tools and walked over. Kyle followed, wiping grease from his hands. "What's wrong?" Jeff asked, eyes narrowing as he took in my expression. "There's someone working on the hydraulic line near the drill deck junction," I said, keeping my voice low despite the shop's noise. "Someone I don't recognize." Jeff's face changed instantly. The casual concern vanished, replaced by alert tension. "Did you talk to him?" he asked sharply. "I tried. He didn't respond." "Good." Jeff turned to Kyle. "Get Brandon and meet us at the hydraulic junction. Tell him it's a code orange." Kyle nodded once and headed for the door without asking questions. Jeff gripped my shoulder. "Tell me exactly what you saw." I described the man's appearance, his unnatural movements, the unnaturally clean tools, and most importantly, the lack of company logo. "Did he look at you? Make eye contact?" Jeff pressed. "No, he never even turned around." "You're lucky." Jeff grabbed a heavy wrench from the bench and shoved it through his belt. "Let's go." As we hurried back toward the hydraulic junction, Jeff radioed someone, speaking in a coded shorthand I didn't fully understand, something about securing the area and checking personnel locations. It took us about 15 minutes to return with Brandon and Kyle in tow. Brandon carried a tablet with the crew manifest displayed, while Kyle held what looked like a small fire extinguisher but with different markings. When we reached the junction, we found it completely empty. The hydraulic line that had been partially disassembled now looked untouched. No tools scattered around, no evidence that anyone had been working there at all. "This is where you saw him?" Brandon asked, looking around carefully. "Yes, right here. He had the line open and was doing something with the valves." Brandon examined the hydraulic line closely. No signs of tampering. System pressure is normal. He checked his tablet. and no work was scheduled for this section today. Jeff walked the perimeter of the area slowly, checking behind equipment racks and in the shadowy spaces between pipes. "Where did he go?" I asked. "There's only one access corridor." "We would have seen him if he left this way," Jeff agreed, finishing his inspection and returning to our group. "Yet he's not here." Kyle looked uneasy. "Should we check the cameras?" Brandon nodded. "Already put in the request. Security will pull the footage." The four of us stood in silence for a moment, the implications sinking in. Someone, or something, had been here minutes ago and had vanished without trace. "Let's get somewhere more secure," Brandon finally said. "Machine shop." Back in the relative safety of the machine shop, with the door closed, Brandon pulled up a complete roster on his tablet. "Every worker currently on this rig is accounted for," he said after checking the locations. "Drilling team is at the platform. Maintenance crews are on scheduled tasks. Everyone else is in living quarters or common areas." "What was that thing, Jeff?" I asked, no longer bothering to hide my unease. Jeff exchanged glances with Brandon, who gave him a small nod. "We don't know exactly," Jeff said, keeping his voice low despite the privacy. "But it's happened before. Several times a year, someone reports seeing a worker they don't recognize. The descriptions vary. Sometimes it's a roughneck, sometimes a technician, once even someone dressed like management. But there are always inconsistencies. Like no logo," I offered. "That's one. Or tools that look new but aren't standard issue. Or they're in areas where no work is scheduled. Most times they don't speak or acknowledge anyone." Kyle sat down heavily on a nearby stool. 2 years ago, Davidson from the night crew tried to help one of them. Said the guy was struggling with a heavy crate, so he went over to lend a hand. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Davidson disappeared for 3 days," Brandon said, his face grim. "We searched everywhere. Then on the 4th morning, we found him inside a ventilation shaft on level 5, a space barely big enough for a person to fit into. He was alive but couldn't remember anything from the moment he approached the stranger. Same thing happened to Whitaker last year," Jeff added. "And Rodriguez before that. They talked to one of these visitors and then turn up days later in impossible places. Storage tanks that lock from the outside, sealed equipment housings, once inside a life raft that hadn't been opened in months." I felt cold despite the shop's warmth. "Has anyone ever caught one on camera?" Brandon shook his head. "Camera footage always shows static or distortion in those exact spots. Security systems go offline for maintenance that no one authorized." "What are they?" I asked. "Same as whatever makes the knocking sounds. Same as whatever sends those purple flares," Jeff said. "They want us, and they use different ways to get to us." The shop felt suddenly too small, too confined. I thought about how close I'd come to approaching that stranger, how I might have tried to get his attention if he hadn't seemed so odd. "We need to implement full buddy protocol for the rest of the shift," Brandon said, checking his watch. "No one works alone, no exceptions. I'll inform all section heads." He looked at me directly. "You did the right thing, Tyler. You followed the rule." As Brandon stepped away to make the necessary calls, Jeff moved closer to me. "Now do you understand?" he asked quietly. "Do you see why the rules matter?" I nodded, unable to find words for a moment. I thought this rig just had some weird superstitions. But it's not that, is it? There's really something out there, something that wants in. "Not just out there," Jeff said, glancing toward the wall of windows that showed the vast expanse of ocean surrounding us. "They're already here. Have been since they built this place. The rules just keep them from getting what they want." As Brandon returned and began organizing the buddy assignments for the remainder of the shift, I couldn't stop thinking about the stranger's unnaturally perfect movements, how he'd worked in complete silence, how he'd vanished without a trace. I wondered what else waited out there in the Gulf waters, watching our metal island with hungry patience, what other forms they might take to get close to us. And most of all, I wondered if the rules would be enough to keep us safe until the next crew transport arrived to take me back to shore. 3 hours after my encounter with the stranger, I found myself on the eastern deck with Jeff, securing loose cables that had come undone during the storm's aftermath. The sky had cleared, revealing a star-filled night above us. The relatively calm weather provided a deceptive sense of normalcy that I no longer trusted. "Hand me that connector," Jeff said, pointing to a coiled mass of industrial-grade wiring. I passed it to him. my mind still replaying the image of that unnatural worker kneeling by the hydraulics. The perfect fluid movements, the pristine tools, the complete silence. "You still thinking about it?" Jeff asked, catching my distant look. "Hard not to," I admitted, helping him thread the heavy cable through a series of metal loops. "I keep wondering where he went, or what he was trying to do to the hydraulic line." Jeff grunted as he pulled the cable tight. "Best not to dwell on it. That's how they get in your head." "They," I echoed. The word held new weight now. Not just a figure of speech, but an acknowledgement of something real and present. We worked in relative silence for the next few minutes, the only sounds coming from the omnipresent hum of machinery and the occasional creak of metal as the rig shifted slightly on its moorings. The night air felt heavy with salt and diesel fumes, the typical scent of life on the platform. Then we heard it. A whistling sound drifted up from somewhere below us, faint at first, but growing clearer. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite a recognizable tune, yet strangely coherent. Something about it tugged at my attention, making it impossible to ignore. Jeff froze beside me, the cable slipping from his fingers. His face changed in an instant, all color draining away. "What is that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Rule 3. No whistling ever. Instead of responding, Jeff lunged toward a nearby emergency station, yanking down on the horn handle. 3 short, deafening blasts cut through the night air, the signal for all personnel to return to central areas immediately. The whistling continued, uninterrupted by the horn. If anything, it seemed to grow more complex, the melody weaving and turning in ways that felt almost mathematical in precision. I felt an inexplicable urge to move toward it, to find its source. "Don't listen to it." Jeff grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Focus on my voice. We need to get to the assembly point." I nodded, forcing myself to turn away from the direction of the whistling. It seemed to be coming from the lower deck, somewhere toward the north side of the rig, the same north side where I'd heard the knocking. We hurried through corridors and downstairs to the designated emergency meeting area, a large open space near the center of the rig. Workers were already streaming in from various sections, their faces tense and alert. Brandon stood near the entrance, checking names off a digital roster as people arrived. "What section are you coming from?" he asked us as we approached. "East deck, upper level," Jeff reported. "The whistling's coming from the lower north side." Brandon nodded grimly, adding something to his notes. More crew members poured in behind us, many looking confused, others with the same grim understanding I saw on Jeff's and Brandon's faces. After 5 tense minutes, Brandon raised his voice. "Quiet, everyone. Roll call." He began calling out names, each worker responding in turn. The process was quick and efficient, clearly something they had practiced many times. I waited for my name, giving a sharp "here" when called. When Brandon reached the end of his list, he paused, frowning at the screen. "Stephen Parker?" Silence answered him. "Has anyone seen Stephen in the last 30 minutes? Kyle stepped forward from the back of the group. He was with me in the equipment room until about 20 minutes ago, said he needed to check something and would be right back. The whistling, still audible even through the closed doors of the assembly area, suddenly made my stomach twist. I remembered the cafeteria incident days earlier when someone had started whistling and Stephen had reacted so strongly. "He's the one whistling," I said, the realization hitting me all at once. "Remember in the cafeteria, how he reacted when that guy started whistling?" Jeff and Brandon exchanged looks. "We need a search team," Brandon announced, scanning the group. "Jeff, Tyler, Kyle, and Mason. The rest of you stay here until we give the all clear." I felt a surge of both fear and determination as I was named to the search party. The 4 of us gathered near the door while Brandon gave quick instructions. "Standard protocol. Stay together. No one breaks off for any reason. If you find him, don't approach alone. Radio immediately." He handed each of us a small radio unit, then checked that we all had our emergency flares, standard orange ones, nothing like the eerie purple light I'd seen during the storm. "And whatever you do," Jeff added, looking each of us in the eye, "don't listen to the whistling. Focus on each other's voices, on the sound of your footsteps, anything but that melody." We stepped out into the corridor, the whistling immediately more pronounced without the buffer of the assembly room doors. It pulled at something deep in my mind, a strange compulsion to follow it to its source. I forced myself to concentrate on counting my steps instead. "We'll start at his last known location and work outward," Brandon said, leading us toward the equipment room where Kyle had last seen Stephen. The equipment room was empty, tools laid out as if someone had stepped away mid-task. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the workbench, still warm to the touch. "He was right here," Kyle said, pointing to a disassembled pump. "Working on this." From there, we followed the most direct path toward the whistling sound, staying tight together as a group. The melody grew louder as we approached the north side, becoming more complex and entrancing with every step. I caught myself unconsciously trying to follow the pattern, to anticipate where the notes would go next. The effort of resisting its pull gave me a dull headache. There, Mason pointed ahead, where a figure stood silhouetted against the night sky. Stephen stood at the north side railing, his back to us, face turned toward the dark water below. His posture was unnaturally straight, his hands gripping the metal bar with white-knuckled intensity. The whistling, that impossible, intricate melody came from him, though his technique seemed too perfect for human lips. "Stephen," Brandon called out. "Stephen, can you hear me?" Stephen gave no indication he'd heard. He continued whistling, the sound now taking on an almost conversational quality, as if responding to something we couldn't hear. I strained to listen, but could detect nothing except the usual sounds of the rig and the distant lapping of waves far below. "Don't get too close," Jeff warned as Brandon took a step forward. "We don't know what state he's in." Brandon stopped, then tried again. "Stephen, this is Brandon. You need to turn around now." Still no response. Stephen remained frozen in place, whistling that haunting tune out toward the water. I noticed something then that made my blood run cold. Beneath his whistling, very faintly, came answering notes from somewhere in the darkness below. Jeff muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer, then moved carefully around to approach Stephen from the side. The rest of us spread out slightly, ready to intercept if Stephen tried to move, or worse, climb over the railing. With deliberate slowness, Jeff reached Stephen and placed a hand on his shoulder. No reaction. Then, in one swift movement, Jeff physically turned Stephen away from the water, breaking his line of sight with whatever might be out there in the darkness. The effect was immediate. Stephen's whistling cut off mid-note. His body went slack, and he would have collapsed if Jeff hadn't caught him. His eyes, which had been fixed and staring, blinked rapidly as awareness returned to them. "What?" Stephen looked around in confusion, taking in our faces and his surroundings. "How did I get here?" "You don't remember coming to the north side?" Brandon asked, moving closer now that the immediate danger seemed past. Stephen shook his head, genuine confusion on his face. "Last thing I remember, I was in the equipment room with Kyle." His eyes widened with sudden panic. Was I whistling? The fear in his voice told me this wasn't the first time this had happened to him. "Let's get him back to the assembly area," Jeff said, keeping a firm grip on Stephen's arm. "We can talk there." As we led Stephen away from the north side, I glanced back once. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the water far below. Not the random pattern of waves, but something deliberate. Something rising slightly from the surface before sinking back into the darkness. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be certain. The return journey passed in tense silence. Stephen walked with us, but his movements seemed sluggish, his eyes not quite focused. Back in the assembly area, the medical officer immediately took him aside for evaluation while Brandon addressed the rest of the crew. "All clear. Resume normal operations, but everyone stays with at least one partner for the remainder of the shift. Department heads, I want hourly check-ins." The group dispersed, relief evident in their movements, but an underlying tension still present. These incidents were clearly not uncommon, yet the fear they generated never diminished. I found myself standing next to Jeff, watching as the medical officer checked Stephen's vital signs. "This has happened to him before, hasn't it?" I asked quietly. Jeff nodded. "3 times that I know of. Stephen's more susceptible than most. We try to keep a closer eye on him, but you can't watch everyone all the time," I finished for him. "Exactly." Jeff ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than his years. "The thing is, Tyler, it's not just about avoiding danger. It's about actively fighting back. Whatever's out there, whatever wants us, it doesn't just wait for us to make mistakes. It calls to us. It lures us. It finds our weaknesses." I thought about how the whistling had affected me, that strange compulsion I'd felt to follow it. How much stronger must it have been for Stephen? The rules aren't just superstitions, I said, finally accepting what part of me had known since hearing those knocks on the north side. They're survival strategies. Yes, Jeff confirmed, and the people who don't follow them. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I'd heard enough about missing workers, about people found in impossible places with no memory of how they got there. As the crew settled back into their routines and Stephen was taken to the medical bay for observation, I realized something fundamental had changed in me. The skepticism I'd arrived with was gone, replaced by an understanding of the genuine danger surrounding us. The rules weren't optional guidelines or quaint traditions. They were the difference between survival and becoming another statistic, another mystery, another name whispered in cautionary tales. My time as a skeptic was permanently over. Now I just had to survive the remaining 2 weeks of my shift, following every rule to the letter before I could return to the safety of shore.